London's West End, November 1988. The Garrick Club was hosting its annual theatrical gala, an evening where Britain's finest actors gathered to celebrate their craft. Michael Caine sat at table 12, wearing his signature understated elegance, a simple black tuxedo that somehow looked more expensive than everyone else's designer suits. He was there to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award, but nobody expected what would happen next, because sitting 3 tables away was Sir Laurence Olivier, the man who would stand up in front of 200 people and destroy Michael Caine's reputation in the most public way possible. What Michael said in response didn't just silence the room. It changed how an entire generation viewed acting forever. The evening had started like any other theatrical awards ceremony. The Garrick Club's grand dining room gleamed with crystal chandeliers and mahogany panels that had witnessed decades of British theatrical history. Waiters in white gloves served champagne that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a week. The guest list read like a who's who of British entertainment. Every major actor, director, and producer in the country had assembled for what was supposed to be a celebration of excellence. But beneath the polite conversation and clinking glasses, there was an undercurrent of tension that had been building for years. The British acting establishment was at a crossroads. On one side stood the traditionalists, classically trained stage actors who had learned their craft in repertory companies, who believed in method acting and formal training. On the other side were the new generation of film actors who had risen through television and cinema, who brought a more naturalistic approach to their performances. Michael Caine represented everything the old guard feared about this new direction. Here was a man who had never attended drama school, who spoke with his natural cockney accent even in interviews, who seemed to effortlessly slip between comedy and drama without any apparent struggle or suffering for his art. To the establishment, he was the embodiment of everything that was wrong with modern acting. The tension had been simmering for months leading up to this evening. There had been whispered conversations in West End theaters about whether Caine truly deserved the Lifetime Achievement Award. Some argued that his box office success and international recognition spoke for themselves. Others suggested that popularity wasn't the same as artistic merit, that selling tickets didn't necessarily mean advancing the art of acting. The Garrick Club had been home to theatrical royalty for over 150 years. Dickens had walked these halls. Churchill had dined in these rooms. The club's burgundy leather chairs and oil paintings of long-dead actors seemed to whisper of tradition, of standards that must be maintained, of artistic integrity that shouldn't be compromised for commercial success. Tonight the room was filled with the biggest names in British entertainment. Dame Judi Dench sat near the front, elegant and gracious, already a legend at 54. Sir Ian McKellen commanded attention at table 5, his theatrical presence unmistakable even in casual conversation. Anthony Hopkins nursed a whiskey in the corner, observing everything with those penetrating eyes that had made him one of the most respected actors of his generation. John Gielgud held court at table 3, regaling younger actors with stories from the golden age of theater. And presiding over it all was Sir Laurence Olivier. 81 years old, still magnificent despite his age, still the undisputed king of British theater. Olivier had defined serious acting for 3 generations. His Hamlet was considered definitive. His film work in Rebecca and Wuthering Heights had elevated cinema to art. He had created the National Theatre, knighted for his contributions to British culture, revered by actors worldwide. When Olivier spoke about acting, people listened. When he gave his approval, careers were made. When he withheld it, dreams could be crushed. But Olivier was a man of another era, trained in a different tradition. He believed that acting was a craft that required years of study, months of preparation for each role, a deep understanding of classical technique. He had little patience for actors who seemed to coast on natural charisma or who made their craft look effortless. To Olivier, if acting looked easy, it probably meant the actor wasn't working hard enough. Michael Caine, by contrast, represented everything Olivier found troubling about modern acting. Caine had grown up in South London, the son of a fish porter and a char lady. His real name was Maurice Joseph Micklewhite Jr., a fact he'd never hidden but also never emphasized. He'd left school at 16, worked various jobs before stumbling into acting almost by accident. He'd never attended RADA or any other prestigious drama school. He'd learned by doing, by watching, by instinct. And yet somehow it had worked. Caine had become one of Britain's most successful actors, starring in films that made money and won critical acclaim. He'd been nominated for Academy Awards. He worked with the greatest directors of his generation: John Huston, Carol Reed, Otto Preminger. He was internationally recognized, financially successful, beloved by audiences. But to men like Olivier, success wasn't enough. Art required struggle, preparation, a deep understanding of technique and tradition. Caine seemed to make it look too easy, as if talent alone was sufficient. This offended Olivier's sense of what acting should be, a noble profession that demanded years of study and preparation. The dinner that night had proceeded normally through the first several courses. The conversation was typical of such events. Industry gossip, discussions of upcoming productions, gentle ribbing between colleagues who'd known each other for decades. Michael had been his usual charming self, telling stories about working with legendary directors, doing impressions that had his tablemates laughing, deflecting compliments with self-deprecating humor. He'd talked about his recent work in The Man Who Would Be King, sharing funny anecdotes about working with Sean Connery in Morocco. He discussed his upcoming projects, his thoughts on the future of British cinema, his hopes that the industry would continue to support original storytelling. Those who knew him well weren't surprised by his graciousness. Michael had always been generous with his time and attention, especially with younger actors who approached him for advice. But throughout dinner, those paying attention noticed that Olivier had been unusually quiet. The great man sat at his table, nursing his wine, observing the proceedings with what seemed like growing disapproval. Several times during the evening, people had seen him looking toward Michael's table with an expression that was hard to read, disappointment perhaps, or disdain. At 9:30, as the dinner plates were being cleared and the awards ceremony was about to begin, Sir Laurence Olivier rose from his seat. The room gradually fell silent as people noticed the elderly actor standing, commanding attention through sheer presence. He was scheduled to present Michael's Lifetime Achievement Award, and everyone expected the usual gracious introduction followed by a heartfelt speech from the recipient. What happened next would be talked about for decades. Olivier walked slowly to the podium, his age showing but his bearing still dignified. He adjusted the microphone, looked out over the assembled crowd, and began to speak in that famous voice that had commanded stages for 50 years. But there was tension in the room that night, a generational divide that had been brewing for decades. The old guard missed classically trained stage actors who'd learned their craft in rep companies, versus the new breed of film actors who'd risen through cinema and television. Michael Caine represented everything the traditionalists feared: success without suffering, fame without formal training, millions earned playing characters that seemed suspiciously close to himself. The conflict wasn't just professional minor, it was philosophical. The older generation believed that acting was about transformation, about completely disappearing into a role through months of preparation and research. They studied accents, lived in character, suffered for their art. The newer generation, exemplified by actors like Caine, believed that authenticity came from staying true to yourself while finding the emotional truth of a character. These philosophical differences had created real tensions in the British acting community. Older actors whispered that the newcomers were lazy, that they relied too heavily on natural charisma instead of learned technique. Younger actors countered that the traditionalists were pretentious, more concerned with showing off their training than connecting with audiences. Michael had been caught in the middle of this divide for years. He respected the older generation and their accomplishments, but he'd never apologized for his own approach to acting. He'd always maintained that there were many ways to serve the truth of a story, that technique was just one tool among many, that natural instinct could be just as valuable as classical training. But tonight that divide was about to explode in the most public way possible. Michael had been acting for 30 years by then. He'd starred in Alfie, which had made him an international star and earned him his first Academy Award nomination. He'd played alongside Sean Connery in The Man Who Would Be King, giving what many considered his finest performance. He'd worked with Carol Reed in The Third Man, holding his own opposite Orson Welles. He'd done comedy in Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, drama in Educating Rita, action in The Italian Job. His range was undeniable, his popularity unquestioned. But to men like Olivier, he was still just Maurice Micklewhite from South London, a cockney upstart who'd gotten lucky in the movies. The fact that Michael had never hidden his working-class background had never tried to adopt a more refined accent or persona, only made it worse in their eyes. To them, it seemed like he was flaunting his lack of proper training, making a mockery of the serious business of acting. The dinner progressed smoothly through the first 3 courses: polite conversation, industry gossip, the usual theatrical small talk. Michael told stories about working with John Huston, made people laugh with his impersonations of directors. He was charming, self-deprecating, exactly what everyone expected from the man who'd become Britain's most recognizable film star. He'd shared a particularly funny anecdote about filming The Italian Job, describing how the famous car chase scene had been much more terrifying to film than it looked on screen. The Mini Cooper drivers, he explained, were actually professional stunt drivers, but Michael and his co-stars had to do some of their own driving for close-up shots. There I was, he'd said with that familiar grin, trying to look cool while absolutely terrified that I was about to drive off an Italian cliff. Not exactly what they taught us in drama school. Oh wait, I never went to drama school. The self-deprecating humor was typical Michael, but it also highlighted the very issue that bothered traditionalists like Olivier. Here was a man making light of his lack of formal training, treating it like a badge of honor rather than something to be embarrassed about. At another point during dinner, a young actor at Michael's table had asked for advice about dealing with difficult directors. Michael's response was characteristically practical. Listen to what they're saying, not how they're saying it. Most directors know what they want. They just don't always know how to communicate it clearly. And remember, they hired you for a reason. Trust your instincts, but be willing to try new things. The camera sees everything, so whatever you're feeling, make sure it's what the character should be feeling. It was sound, practical advice delivered without pretension. But to someone like Olivier, it probably seemed superficial, lacking the depth and complexity that acting required. Where was the discussion of character motivation, of text analysis, of the deep preparation that serious roles demanded? The conversation continued pleasantly enough, but those paying attention might have noticed that the various tables weren't mixing as much as usual. The older, theater-trained actors gravitated toward each other, while the film actors formed their own groups. It was subtle, but the divisions were there. At 9:30, as dessert was being served, Sir Laurence Olivier rose to present Michael's award. The room gradually quieted as people noticed the elderly actor standing. He walked slowly to the podium, his movements careful but still dignified. At 81, Olivier was still an imposing figure, his presence commanding attention even before he spoke. What came out of his mouth wasn't congratulations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Olivier began, his voice carrying that perfect diction that had commanded stages for 50 years. "Tonight we honor Michael Caine for his contributions to British cinema, and I want to take this moment to speak honestly about what those contributions represent." There was something in his tone that made people look up from their desserts. This didn't sound like the usual gracious introduction. Dame Judi Dench frowned slightly, sensing that something was off. Ian McKellen set down his fork, his attention fully focused on Olivier. Anthony Hopkins stopped mid-conversation, his actor's instincts picking up on the subtle change in the room's energy. The room went quiet, that peculiar silence that comes when people sense drama approaching but aren't sure what form it will take. Waiters paused in their service, unsure whether to continue or step back. The clink of silverware on china faded away as conversations died. "Michael has achieved something remarkable in his career," Olivier continued, his voice gaining strength and clarity. "He has managed to convince the world that Michael Caine the person and Michael Caine the actor are the same individual. Every role, every performance, every character. They're all variations on the same theme. Morese from South London, slightly refined for the cameras." A few uncomfortable laughs scattered through the audience. Some people thought this might be building to a compliment. After all, consistency was a valuable quality in an actor. But others, more attuned to the subtle shifts in Olivier's tone, began to realize this wasn't heading toward praise. Michael sat perfectly still, his face revealing nothing. But those who knew him well, Frank Finlay at his table, who'd worked with him several times, and photographer Terry O'Neill, who'd become a close friend, could see the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes. Michael's poker face was legendary, developed through years of playing characters who had to hide their true feelings, but subtle signs were there for those who knew how to read them. His hands remained steady on the table, but his knuckles had gone slightly white as he gripped his napkin. His breathing remained even, but there was a stillness to his posture that suggested coiled energy, like an animal preparing to defend itself. Olivier continued, either unaware of or unconcerned by the growing tension in the room. Now, some might call this consistency. Others might call it authenticity, but I believe we must call it what it is. An actor who has never truly acted, who has made a career of being himself in different costumes, different settings, different accents, though always that same unmistakable cockney bleeding through. The room was dead silent now. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving, frozen by the electric tension that was building. Dame Judy looked mortified, her face pale with shock at what she was witnessing. Ian McKellen stared at his plate, clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of this attack. Anthony Hopkins watched Michael with fascination, his analytical mind already anticipating how this confrontation would unfold. At table 7, Frank Finlay leaned forward slightly, ready to intervene if necessary. Terry O'Neill's hand moved toward his camera by instinct before he caught himself. This wasn't the time for photographs. At the head table, several of the evening's organizers looked at each other in panic, unsure whether they should intervene or let this play out. But the most riveting figure in the room was Michael himself, sitting with supernatural calm as one of Britain's most respected actors publicly dismantled his career and reputation. But what came out of his mouth wasn't congratulations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Olivier began, his voice carrying that perfect diction that had commanded stages for 50 years. "Tonight we honor Michael Caine for his contributions to British cinema, and I want to take this moment to speak honestly about what those contributions represent." The room went quiet. Something in Olivier's tone suggested this wasn't going to be a typical award speech. Michael has achieved something remarkable in his career. He has managed to convince the world that Michael Caine the person and Michael Caine the actor are the same individual. Every role, every performance, every character. They're all variations on the same theme. Maurice from South London, slightly refined for the cameras. A few uncomfortable laughs scattered through the audience. This was feeling less like praise and more like a roast. Michael sat perfectly still, his face revealing nothing, but inside something was building. Olivier continued, his voice gaining strength. "Now, some might call this consistency, others might call it authenticity, but I believe we must call it what it is. An actor who has never truly acted, who has made a career of being himself in different costumes, different settings, different accents, though always that same unmistakable cockney bleeding through." The room was dead silent now. Dame Judy looked mortified. Ian McKellen stared at his plate. Anthony Hopkins watched Michael with fascination, waiting to see how he'd respond. You see, real acting requires transformation. It requires an actor to disappear completely, to become someone else entirely. It requires training, discipline, the ability to find truth in fiction. Michael has mastered the art of being likable, of being charismatic, of being charming. But has he ever truly acted? Has he ever disappeared into a role so completely that we forgot we were watching Michael Caine? The words hung in the air like a physical presence. This wasn't just criticism, this was a fundamental challenge to Michael's entire career, his life's work, his professional identity. Olivier was suggesting that everything Michael had achieved was built on a foundation of mediocrity, that his success was undeserved, that he was fundamentally not a real actor. Around the room, people's reactions varied wildly. Some of the older, theater-trained actors nodded slightly, perhaps thinking that someone needed to say what they'd all been thinking. Others looked appalled at the public nature of the attack. The younger generation of actors looked stunned. This was their peer being eviscerated by the establishment, and they could easily imagine themselves in Michael's position. Michael's table mates were frozen. Frank Finlay's face had gone red with anger, but he didn't know how to intervene without making things worse. Terry O'Neill found himself gripping the edge of the table, fighting every instinct to stand up and defend his friend. The evening's organizers at the head table were having whispered, frantic conversations about whether they should stop this somehow, but they were paralyzed by Olivier's stature, who stopped Sir Laurence Olivier in the middle of a speech. But the most remarkable thing in the room was Michael's reaction, or lack thereof. He sat with impossible stillness, his face a mask of calm concentration. If Olivier's words were hitting their mark, Michael wasn't showing it. His breathing remained steady, his posture unchanged. Only the slight tightening around his eyes suggested that he was hearing every word and processing its implications. Olivier, perhaps emboldened by Michael's apparent passivity, pressed on. You see, I've watched Michael's career with interest over the years. Film after film where he essentially plays variations of himself, the charming rogue, the working-class hero, the man who gets by on wit and luck rather than preparation or depth. And audiences love it. They love the familiarity, the predictability. They know exactly what they're getting when they buy a ticket to a Michael Caine film. He paused, letting that sink in before delivering what he clearly thought would be the killing blow. But is that acting? Or is that simply being an engaging personality who happens to work in films? I've spent my entire career studying the great actors Garrick, Irving, Gielgud. They transformed themselves for each role. They disappeared so completely into their characters that audiences forgot who they were watching. That is the definition of great acting. And by that standard, Olivier raised his glass, his voice taking on a tone of theatrical finality. So tonight we celebrate Michael Caine not for his acting, because I'm not certain we've seen him truly act, but for his remarkable achievement in convincing the world that being yourself is enough. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the kind of silence that comes after a car crash, when everyone is processing what they've just witnessed and trying to decide how to react. Some people looked at their plates, embarrassed to be witnessing this public humiliation. Others stared at Michael, waiting to see how he would respond to this devastating attack. The applause that eventually came was scattered, uncomfortable, confused. Nobody knew what was expected of them. A few people clapped out of habit, others out of respect for Olivier's stature, still others out of sheer nervousness. But it was clear that everyone in the room understood they had just witnessed something extraordinary and deeply uncomfortable. One of Britain's greatest actors had just publicly eviscerated another at an awards ceremony, specifically meant to honor the victim's achievements. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 seconds, nobody moved. The organizers looked paralyzed. Olivier stood at the podium with an expression of satisfied completion, as if he'd just delivered a particularly challenging Shakespearean soliloquy. The audience sat frozen, unsure how to process what they'd just witnessed. And then Michael Caine stood up. He rose from his chair with that familiar, unhurried movement that had become his trademark in dozens of films. No sudden gestures, no visible anger, no dramatic flourishes. He simply stood, adjusted his jacket with a slight tug at the lapels, a gesture so characteristically him that half the room recognized it from his movies, and walked toward the podium. The walk seemed to take forever. Every step was measured, deliberate, calm. Michael's face showed no emotion beyond polite attention, as if he were simply going up to receive an award in the normal course of events. But everyone in the room understood that they were about to witness either a complete humiliation or something unprecedented. When Michael reached the podium, Olivier stepped aside, but not before the two men made eye contact for a brief moment. In that instant, something passed between them. Not quite a challenge, but an acknowledgement that lines had been crossed and there would be consequences. Michael approached the microphone with the same casual confidence he'd shown in countless film scenes. He looked out at the crowd for a long moment, his eyes scanning the faces, taking in the tension, the anticipation, the mix of sympathy and curiosity that filled the room. Then he looked directly at Olivier and spoke. "Laurence," he said, his voice calm and clear, carrying easily through the silent room. "That was beautifully delivered. Really beautifully delivered. The diction, the timing, the building dramatic tension, it was a performance worthy of your reputation." A few people smiled nervously, thinking perhaps Michael was going to deflect with humor, turn this into a gracious moment that would diffuse the tension and allow everyone to move on with their evening. But Michael wasn't finished, and his next words changed the entire trajectory of the confrontation. "But I have to ask you something, Laurence. In all your years of training, all your time at the Old Vic, all your study of method and technique, did anyone ever teach you the difference between acting and lying to yourself?" The room went dead silent. This wasn't deflection or humor, this was a direct counterattack, delivered with surgical precision and devastating calm. The smile disappeared from Olivier's face. Around the room, people leaned forward in their seats, suddenly understanding that this wasn't going to be a gracious acceptance of criticism. Michael Caine was about to fight back, and he was going to do it with words as sharp as any sword. Michael continued, his voice never rising, never losing that measured tone that made every word hit like a precisely aimed blow. You talk about transformation, about disappearing into roles. But let me tell you something about transformation that they don't teach at RADA. The hardest role any actor can play is themselves. Do you know why? Because it requires absolute honesty. No hiding behind accents, no disappearing into someone else's pain, no using other people's words to avoid your own truth. The audience was completely still now. Even the background noise from the kitchen had stopped, as if the entire building was holding its breath. You've made a career playing kings and nobles and tragic heroes, always someone grander than yourself, someone more important, more significant. And yes, you're brilliant at it. Nobody disputes that. But here's what I've noticed, Laurence. In 50 years of watching you perform, I've never once seen you, not the real you, just an endless parade of characters that let you hide from who you really are. Someone in the audience gasped audibly. But Michael still wasn't finished. He was building to something bigger, something that would reframe this entire confrontation. Because that's what you can't forgive, isn't it? That I kept my accent, that I stayed connected to where I came from, that I didn't pretend to be something I wasn't. You see me as common because I never learned to disguise my commonness the way you did. The words landed like physical blows. Around the room, people were beginning to understand that they weren't just witnessing a professional disagreement, they were watching two fundamentally different philosophies of life and art clash in the most public way possible. Dame Judi Dench had tears in her eyes, though whether from embarrassment, sympathy, or recognition of some deeper truth was impossible to say. Ian McKellen was staring at Michael with something approaching awe. This was masterful verbal combat disguised as thoughtful discourse. Anthony Hopkins found himself studying Michael's technique with professional fascination. This wasn't just an angry response to an attack. This was a carefully constructed performance designed to achieve maximum impact while maintaining the moral high ground. But what happened next would be remembered and quoted for decades to come. Michael's voice grew quieter, more intimate, but somehow more powerful. Let me tell you about the hardest scene I ever played, Laurence. It was in Alfie 1966. The scene where Alfie realizes he's destroyed his relationship with the one woman who really mattered to him. 5 minutes of screen time where I had to show a man facing the emptiness of his own life, the consequences of his selfishness, the moment when charm and wit aren't enough anymore. He paused, his eyes never leaving Olivier's face. I didn't research that role in a library, Laurence. I didn't study other performances or analyze the text for months. I didn't disappear into the character's background or create elaborate backstories. I just reached inside myself and found every moment of regret I'd ever experienced, every relationship I'd damaged through carelessness, every time I'd chosen easy pleasure over difficult love, and I put it all on screen, naked and honest and unprotected. The room was absolutely silent. Even the sounds from outside London traffic, distant conversations seemed to have faded away, leaving only Michael's voice and the rapt attention of 200 people hanging on every word. That's what you call being yourself. Using your own pain, your own truth, your own flaws to create something that makes other people feel less alone in their own mistakes. Taking the risk that audiences will see through you completely, will judge not just your performance but your soul. Michael stepped closer to the microphone, his voice dropping even lower but somehow becoming more audible. You talk about disappearing into a role, but maybe the bravest thing an actor can do is appear in one. Really appear. Not hide behind someone else's nobility or someone else's tragedy, but stand there as yourself and trust that your own truth is enough. Trust that your own experiences, even if they're common, even if they're unglamorous, even if they don't involve kings or tragic heroes, are worth sharing. Around the room, people were leaning forward, drawn in by the intensity of Michael's words. This wasn't just a defense of his career, it was a manifesto about authenticity, about the courage required to be yourself in a world that often demands you be someone else. I know who I am, Laurence. I'm Maurice Micklewhite from South London. My father carried fish for a living. My mother cleaned other people's houses. I left school at 16 and worked in a butter factory before I ever set foot on a stage. And you know what? I'm proud of that. I'm proud of where I came from, because it taught me something that all the training in the world can't teach, that every human being, from a billionaire to a street cleaner, has the same basic emotions, the same fundamental needs. He gestured toward the audience, including them in his vision. And when I play a character, I don't try to become someone else. I find the part of me that understands what they're going through. When I played Alfie, I found the part of me that had hurt people I cared about. When I played Harry Palmer, I found the part of me that felt like an outsider trying to prove himself. When I played Professor Higgins in Educating Rita, I found the part of me that had to learn that teaching is really about learning. Several people in the audience nodded, beginning to understand the sophistication of what Michael was describing, not the absence of technique, but a different kind of technique entirely. That's why people connect with my films, Laurence. Not because I'm hiding my true self, but because I'm sharing it. When I play a working-class man struggling to make it, they see their own struggles. When I play someone trying to be more sophisticated than they really are, they recognize their own insecurities. That's not a failure of acting. That's the point of acting. Olivier opened his mouth as if to interject, but Michael held up a hand, not aggressively, but with quiet authority. I'm not finished. You want to know the real difference between us? It's not talent, we've both got that. It's not intelligence. I suspect we're both reasonably bright. It's not even artistic vision. The difference is that I understand something you don't. There's room for both of us. This was the crucial moment, the point where Michael shifted from defense to a broader philosophy. Your serious films and my crowd pleasers can coexist. They serve different purposes. They reach different audiences. Your Hamlet is brilliant, necessary, important. My Italian Job is entertaining, accessible, fun. Neither one is better or worse. They're just different. But you seem to think that for your approach to be valid, mine has to be illegitimate. The logic was undeniable, and people around the room were beginning to nod in agreement. You act like acting is something sacred, something that elevates you above ordinary people. I act like acting is something that connects me to ordinary people. You perform for critics and other actors and people who analyze technique. I perform for the mother of 3 who pays £8 to escape her life for 2 hours, for the factory worker who sees something of himself in my characters, for the teenager who watches one of my films and thinks maybe he can make something of himself too. Michael's eyes moved across the room, making eye contact with various people as he spoke. That's why my films make money, Laurence. Not because I'm selling out, but because I'm buying in. Buying into the idea that everyone's story matters, that everyone deserves to see themselves reflected on screen, that the highest calling of an actor isn't to prove how brilliant he is, but to prove how human we all are. The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet that had followed Olivier's attack. This was the silence of people processing something profound, something that challenged assumptions they'd held for years. Olivier's face had gone through several changes during Michael's response. From surprise to anger to something approaching confusion. This wasn't the defensive spluttering he'd expected. This was a coherent, passionate, and devastating counterargument, delivered with the same calm precision that had made Michael's film performances so effective. Michael's voice softened but lost none of its power. I respect what you've accomplished, Laurence. I really do. You've been magnificent in roles that required incredible skill and preparation. You've advanced the art of acting in ways that benefit every performer who comes after you. But don't mistake your methods for the only methods. Don't confuse your kind of truth with the only truth. He picked up the award from the podium, holding it casually, as if he'd almost forgotten about it. This isn't for being myself in different costumes. This is for 30 years of trying to tell honest stories about real people in a way that makes those stories accessible to everyone, not just the people who can afford West End theater tickets or who studied at prestigious drama schools. Michael looked directly at Olivier one final time. If that's not acting, then I'll wear that badge proudly. If staying true to where you come from is somehow a betrayal of the craft, then I'll betray it gladly. And if using your own truth to illuminate other people's truth is somehow cheating, then I'm the biggest cheater in the business. He raised the award slightly, addressing the entire room now. Thank you for this honor. I'll treasure it not because it validates my approach to acting, but because it represents recognition for everyone who's ever been told they weren't good enough, sophisticated enough, trained enough to tell their story. For everyone who refused to hide who they were to become who they wanted to be. The applause that followed was unlike anything anyone in that room had ever experienced at an awards ceremony. It started slowly, with a few people clapping uncertainly, but it quickly built into something thunderous and sustained. People were on their feet. Not the polite standing ovation of industry courtesy, but genuine enthusiastic appreciation. Dame Judi Dench was crying openly now, overwhelmed by the power of what she'd just witnessed. Ian McKellen was nodding emphatically, his face showing clear admiration for Michael's performance. Anthony Hopkins, who rarely showed emotion publicly, was clapping with obvious appreciation for the masterful way Michael had handled the confrontation. Young actors throughout the room were applauding not just for Michael but for themselves, for everyone who'd ever felt like an outsider, everyone who'd been told their background wasn't good enough, everyone who'd been made to feel that their natural way of being wasn't sufficient for serious art. The standing ovation went on for nearly 3 minutes, but its impact would last much longer. Only Laurence Olivier remained seated, his face a mask of conflicted emotions, anger, embarrassment, but perhaps also a grudging recognition that he had underestimated his opponent. When Michael walked back to his table, completely composed, he sat down and picked up his wineglass as if nothing unusual had happened. But everything had changed. Within an hour, the story was spreading through London's theatrical community like wildfire. By the next morning, it was front-page news in every British newspaper. Caine defends his crown, read the Telegraph. A knight defends his realm, declared the Times. The night Michael Caine changed British acting, proclaimed the Guardian. But the real impact wasn't in the headlines. It was in the conversations that followed, the debates that raged in drama schools and rehearsal rooms and pub discussions across Britain. Michael Caine had articulated something that had been building for years, on his defense of accessibility, of connection, of the idea that entertainment and art weren't mutually exclusive. In the weeks that followed, Michael received hundreds of letters from young actors thanking him for his words. Drama schools began incorporating discussions of the Caine approach into their curricula, not as a replacement for classical training, but as an alternative path that was equally valid. 3 months after the Garrick Club incident, something unexpected happened. Laurence Olivier requested a private meeting with Michael. They met at Olivier's home in Brighton, overlooking the sea, on a gray March afternoon that perfectly matched the complexity of their relationship. "I've been thinking about what you said," Olivier admitted as they sat in his study, surrounded by photographs from 50 years of legendary performances, about hiding behind other people's words, other people's nobility. Michael waited, saying nothing. "You were right about something," Olivier continued, his famous voice quieter now, more reflective. "I have spent 50 years becoming everyone except myself. Every role was an opportunity to be someone grander, more important, more tragic than Larry Olivier from Surrey. And perhaps there's something to be said for your approach." They talked for 4 hours that afternoon, 2 master actors exploring the fundamental questions of their craft. They didn't become close friends. Their approaches remained too different for that, but they found something more valuable: mutual respect and understanding. When Olivier died 3 years later, his final interview included this remarkable quote: "Michael Caine taught me that there are many ways to serve the truth. Mine was to disappear into other people's greatness. His was to find the greatness in his own truth. Both are valid. Both are necessary. The theater needs its kings and tragic heroes, but it also needs its everyman, its voice for the common experience." Michael understood something that took me 70 years to learn, that being yourself completely is the hardest role of all. The legacy of that night at the Garrick Club extended far beyond the careers of 2 actors. Michael Caine had given permission to an entire generation to be themselves, to trust their instincts, to believe that their own truth was worth sharing. When actors like Hugh Grant, Colin Firth, or Daniel Craig emerged in later years, staying true to their natural personas while achieving international success, they were walking a path that Michael had carved that night. Today, when we talk about authentic performances, when we value actors who bring their own truth to their roles rather than disappearing completely into them, we're following principles that Michael Caine defended against the greatest actor of his generation. Sir Laurence Olivier called Michael Caine a fraud in front of 200 people. Michael's response didn't just silence his critics. It revolutionized how we think about acting, authenticity, and the courage to be yourself in a world that often demands you be someone else.